$50. A single crumpled bill smelling faintly of cheap tobacco and sweat. That's what it cost to erase the last physical anchor of a dead man's life. When Hannah handed over the keys to her late husband's rusted Harley, she thought she was buying herself room to breathe. She thought the ghosts would finally leave her damp, crowded garage. She was wrong, because when you sell a piece of a man's soul to a stranger, you never know who's going to show up at your door to collect the debt. The garage smelled of dry rot, stale gasoline, and the sharp, metallic tang of mice. It was a stagnant, heavy air that caught in the back of Hannah's throat every time she opened the side door. For 7 months, she had avoided this space. It had become a tomb for things that no longer mattered. A broken lawnmower, stacks of cardboard boxes softening in the humidity, and the blue plastic tarp in the center of the concrete floor. Beneath that tarp was the Harley. Hannah stood in the doorway, a mug of lukewarm black coffee in her hand, staring at the blue plastic. The tarp was disintegrating. Tiny blue flakes of it had drifted onto the oil-stained concrete like toxic snow. She took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter, acidic. It matched the tight, sour knot behind her ribs. Her husband, Tom, had brought the bike home in the back of a U-Haul 5 years ago, 3 years before the deployment that shattered his spine, and 4.5 years before his heart finally gave out in his sleep. It was an older model, an evolution engine, he had told her with a pride she hadn't fully understood. It needed work. It needed love. Going to strip it down to the frame, Sarah, he had said, wiping grease from his forehead with the back of a thick, calloused hand. Make it loud. Make it mean. Then came the IED. Then came the wheelchair. Then came the ramps built over the front steps, the hospital bed in the living room, the endless, grinding hum of the oxygen concentrator, and the slow, agonizing evaporation of the man she loved. The Harley sat untouched. The tires went flat. The chrome pitted and bloomed with orange rust. The battery died, and with it, the someday Tom had clung to. Hannah set her mug down on a workbench, cluttered with rusty sockets and a dried-out tube of Loctite. She needed space. More pressing than that, she needed money. The VA benefits had tied themselves up in bureaucratic red tape following his death, and the life insurance policy barely covered the funeral and the outstanding medical debt. The final notice from the electric company was sitting on the kitchen counter, glaring at her in bold red ink. $48.12 past due. She walked over to the bike. The concrete was freezing against the thin soles of her worn sneakers. She grabbed the edge of the stiff, dusty tarp and pulled it back. A cloud of dust plumed into the single shaft of sunlight, cutting through the grimy window. Hannah coughed, waving the air in front of her face. The bike was a ghost ship. The black paint was dull, covered in a thick film of grey grime. Spiderwebs stretched between the handlebars and the mirrors. It looked incredibly heavy. It looked dead. She ran a finger over the leather seat. It was cracked, feeling like dry, ancient skin under her touch. She didn't feel a wellspring of beautiful, cinematic tears. She felt tired. A deep, bone-aching exhaustion that made her lower back throb and her temples pound. She hated this motorcycle. She hated that it had survived when Tom hadn't. She hated that it took up space in a garage she couldn't afford to heat, mocking her with the phantom sound of a roaring engine that would never fire up again. Pulling her phone from the back pocket of her jeans, she opened the camera. No staging, no wiping it down. She snapped 3 photos. The flash caught the rust on the exhaust pipes, highlighting the decay. She opened the local marketplace app. Harley-Davidson Project Bike. Hasn't run in years. No idea what year or model, don't ask. Clean title somewhere in the house, we'll find it. She paused at the price field. She didn't know what it was worth. Hundreds. Thousands. She didn't care. She wanted it gone today. She wanted the visual reminder of Tom's lost future out of her sight before she lost her nerve. Price, $50. Firm, you load it. Come get it today. She hit post. She didn't look back as she pulled the side door shut, the latch clicking with a hollow finality. It took less than 20 minutes for the phone to buzz. Then it buzzed again. And again. Her inbox flooded with rapid-fire messages. Still available. I'm on my way. I'll give you 100. I'll give you 200. Hannah turned the phone face down on the kitchen counter. The desperation of the internet vultures made her skin crawl. She ignored them all except for the very first message she received. A simple text from a guy named Gary. Gary, have truck, have ramps, $50 cash, be there in 10. She replied with the address. When the truck pulled into the driveway, it wasn't a sleek pickup. It was a rusted early 2000s Ford Ranger that sounded like it had a hole in the muffler. It sputtered and choked before the engine died with a violent shudder. The driver's side door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He didn't look like a biker. He looked like a guy who bought cheap things to sell for slightly less cheap things. He was thin, wearing a faded gray hoodie, stained work boots, and a baseball cap pulled low over greasy blonde hair. He had a cigarette pinched between his lips, the ash growing dangerously long. Hannah met him in the driveway. She had her arms crossed tight across her chest, a defense mechanism against the biting wind and the sudden spike of nausea rolling in her gut. "You Gary?" she asked. He flicked the cigarette onto her driveway and crushed it beneath his boot. He didn't say hello. "Where's the bike?" Hannah wordlessly led him to the garage and hit the button for the overhead door. The chain rattled and complained, the motor straining as the door jerked upward, revealing the dusty metallic carcass in the center of the floor. Gary walked in. He didn't look at the house, didn't notice the wheelchair ramp outside, didn't ask about the history. He just stared at the metal. He walked a circle around it, kicking the flat rear tire with the toe of his boot. "Tires are shot. Rims are rusted out," he muttered, his voice raspy. "Engine's probably seized. You sure it's a Harley? Badges are gone." "It's a Harley," Hannah said. Her voice sounded flat, mechanical. "My husband bought it," Gary grunted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin wad of cash. He peeled off 2 20s and a 10. The bills were soft, limp, and smelled faintly of gasoline. He held them out. Hannah looked at the money. It was exactly what she asked for, but holding it felt like a betrayal. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her fingers hovering over the worn green paper, before she snatched it from his hand. "I got the title on the bench," she said, nodding toward the back. Gary didn't care about the title. He barely glanced at the paper she handed him, shoving it into his hoodie pocket. "Help me push it," he said. They wrestled the dead weight of the machine towards the driveway. It fought them the whole way. The flat tires dragged against the concrete, making a wet, rubbery, squealing sound. The front brake caliper was half seized, forcing them to heave their body weight against the handlebars just to move it an inch at a time. Hannah pushed from the rear fender, her palms pressing into the cold, dusty metal. She could feel the grit embedding into her skin. She was sweating despite the cold. When they finally got it to the base of the aluminum ramps hooked to the tailgate of the Ranger, Gary paused, panting. "All right, on 3. Push hard, lady? 1, 2, 3. They shoved. The heavy metal beast groaned, the front tire hitting the ramp. The aluminum flexed and screamed against the steel of the tailgate. It was a terrible sound, like bone scraping against bone. They got it halfway up before the momentum died. The bike started to roll backward. "Push!" Gary barked, his boots slipping on the asphalt. Hannah closed her eyes and drove her shoulder into the sissy bar, her legs burning. She thought of Tom. She thought of him trying to transfer from his wheelchair to the bed, the sheer, stubborn physical effort of a body that refused to cooperate. She pushed with a sudden, violent burst of anger. The rear tire crested the tailgate, and the bike slammed into the bed of the truck with a heavy, metallic thud. The Ranger's suspension bottomed out, squeaking in protest. Gary didn't say thank you. He grabbed two ratty, frayed tie-down straps from the cab and hooked them to the handlebars, cranking them down. The bike's front forks compressed, pulling the machine down tight. It looked trapped. Captured. "Have a good one?" Gary mumbled, sliding into the driver's seat. Hannah stood in the driveway, the $50 clutched so tightly in her fist that her knuckles were white. She watched the rusted Ford back out into the street. The Harley swayed in the bed, looking smaller, pathetic, just a pile of scrap metal heading to a junkyard or a chop shop. As the truck disappeared around the corner, the silence of the neighborhood crashed down on her. She turned and looked at the open garage. The space where the bike had been was glaringly empty. A dark black stain of old oil marked the concrete like a shadow that refused to leave. She had her room to breathe, but she felt like she was suffocating. The electric bill was paid. It cost $48.12. That left Hannah with $1.88 from the sale of Tom's dream. 3 weeks passed. The weather turned colder, the sky locking into a permanent bruising grey. Hannah settled back into her routine of survival. She worked her shifts at the local grocery store, stocking shelves until her shoulders ached, and came home to a house that felt too large and too quiet. She tried to ignore the garage. But the oil stain bothered her. It was the first thing she saw when she parked her rusted Honda Civic. It was a stubborn, visceral reminder of what she had let go. On a Tuesday afternoon, her day off, she decided it had to go. She went to the hardware store and bought a bottle of heavy-duty industrial degreaser and a stiff wire brush. She poured the purple liquid onto the black stain. It smelled like bleach and ammonia, a harsh chemical sting that burned her nostrils. She dropped to her knees on the freezing concrete and started scrubbing. She scrubbed until her arm burned, until the wire bristles splayed outward, bent and useless. She scrubbed until she scraped her knuckles against the rough floor, drawing bright beads of blood that mixed with the purple chemical foam. She grabbed a hose and washed it away. The water swirled black and grey towards the driveway. When the concrete dried, the stain was still there. Paler, perhaps, but undeniably there. Deep in the porous surface of the stone. Unremovable. Hannah sat back on her heels, staring at it, and for the first time since Tom died, she let out a sound. It wasn't a cry. It was a dry, ragged heave, a sob that carried no tears, just a violent expulsion of air. She dropped the brush. She was so tired of fighting ghosts. She went inside, washed her bleeding hands in the kitchen sink, and wrapped a paper towel around her knuckles. The silence of the house pressed against her eardrums. The refrigerator hummed. The clock over the stove ticked. Then she felt it. Before she heard the sound, she felt a vibration in her chest. A low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to travel up through the floorboards. The cheap glass of her kitchen window rattled slightly in its frame. Hannah looked up. The vibration grew into a sound, a deep, guttural, syncopated roar. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a sports car or the broken sputter of Gary's truck. It was heavy, symmetrical, immense. She walked to the front window and pulled back the faded curtain. 3 motorcycles were turning onto her quiet, suburban street. They were massive, gleaming machines, entirely black and chrome, riding in a tight, disciplined stagger. The sound they made bounced off the aluminum siding of the houses, drowning out the world. Hannah's breath hitched in her throat. They weren't slowing down to look at houses. They were coming here. The lead rider swung his bike in a wide, sweeping arc, cutting into her driveway. The 2 behind him followed in perfect synchronization. They parked side by side, taking up the entirety of the cracked asphalt, blocking her Civic in. They killed the engines almost simultaneously. The sudden silence that followed was heavier and more intimidating than the roar had been. The hot metal of their exhaust pipes ticked and pinged in the cold air. Hannah stepped back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. These weren't weekend warriors. These weren't accountants playing dress-up in pristine leather. They were large men. Hard men. They wore heavily worn leather cuts over flannel shirts and black hoodies. The man in the middle, the one who had led the pack, was massive. His beard was grey and unkempt, his face weathered into deep, topographical lines of exposure and miles. But it was the patches on their backs that made Hannah's stomach drop into her shoes. The red and white lettering, the winged death head, Hell's Angels. They were standing in her driveway, taking off their heavy leather gloves, looking directly at her front door. Hannah backed away from the window, her hands shaking. Why were they here? She hadn't done anything. Tom didn't have debts, did he? Tom was a disabled infantryman, not a gangster. He spent his time at the VA clinic, not at biker bars. The doorbell rang, a single, jarring chime. She didn't move. She stood in the hallway, pressing her back against the wall, hoping they would just leave. Then came the knock. It wasn't aggressive, but it was heavy, a knuckles-on-wood rap that demanded an answer. "Mrs. Miller?" A voice called out through the door. It was surprisingly calm, deep, and gravelly. "Hannah Miller? We know you're in there. We just want to talk." Hannah squeezed her eyes shut. She thought about calling the police, but her phone was on the kitchen counter, and the counter felt miles away. She looked down at her hands, still wrapped in the bloody paper towel from scrubbing the garage floor. "You sold a piece of a man's soul," a voice whispered in the back of her mind. She took a deep breath, the smell of ammonia and old oil still clinging to her clothes. She stepped away from the wall, walked to the heavy wooden front door, and wrapped her trembling hand around the deadbolt. With a loud metallic clack, she unlocked it and pulled the door open. The three men stood on her small concrete porch. Up close, they smelled of exhaust fumes, cold leather, and stale coffee. The lead rider, the massive man with the grey beard, looked down at her. He took his sunglasses off, revealing eyes that were surprisingly sharp, a piercing, icy blue. He didn't look angry. He looked intently focused. "Hannah?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice cracking. "What do you want?" "If it's about Tom, he's gone. He passed away." The man nodded slowly. He looked past her, glancing briefly at the empty garage, before bringing his pale blue eyes back to her face. "We know he passed, Mom," the man said. He reached into his thick leather vest. Hannah flinched, taking a half step back, her muscles tightening. But he didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a piece of paper, folded in half. He handed it to her. Hannah took it with her, shaking, bandaged hand. She unfolded it. It was the bill of sale she had signed for Gary, the one she had handed over in exchange for $50. It was stained with a bloody thumbprint, not hers, in the bottom corner. "We need to talk about the bike you sold," the man said softly. "And we need to talk about your husband." The front door remained open just enough to let the bitter wind cut across the threshold. It whipped around Hannah's ankles, chilling the sweat that had suddenly broken out on her neck. She stared at the paper in her hand. The bloody thumbprint on the bill of sale was a rusted brownish red. It looked like a mistake on a butcher's receipt. "Gary," she whispered. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. The grey-bearded man didn't smile. The deep lines framing his mouth hardened. "Gary's having a bad week. He runs a salvage yard off Route 9, mostly stolen catalytic converters and stripped copper. He tried to flip an Evolution engine to one of our prospects yesterday afternoon. He didn't check the VIN against the frame. Or maybe he didn't care. We cared." Hannah looked up. The physical presence of the three men was suffocating. They blocked the pale afternoon sun, casting long, warped shadows across her narrow hallway. The smell of them was intensely raw: old leather, heavy motor oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of cold pavement. "I don't understand," Hannah said. Her voice lacked volume. She sounded like a little girl, and she hated herself for it. "It's a hunk of junk. It hasn't run in 5 years. Why do you care about a $50 frame? Can we come in, Mrs. Miller?" The leader asked. It wasn't a request. It was a polite demand wrapped in gravel. "My name is Donovan. These are Wyatt and Cole. We aren't here to collect a debt. We're here to settle one." Hannah hesitated. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to slam the heavy wooden door, throw the deadbolt, and hide in the bathroom with a phone. But her legs felt like they were poured from lead. And there was something in Donovan's eyes, a strange, heavy grief that mirrored the suffocating weight she had been carrying for 7 months. She stepped back. The men walked into her home. Their heavy engineer boots thudded against the cheap, faux wood laminate flooring. The house instantly felt entirely too small. They seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. Hannah led them into the living room. She hadn't vacuumed in weeks. A thin layer of dust coated the glass of the coffee table. The faint, antiseptic smell of Tom's oxygen concentrator still lingered in the drywall, a phantom hospital scent that fought against the heavy odor of exhaust the men brought with them. Donovan stopped in the center of the room. He looked at the deep gouges in the door frame leading to the kitchen, scars from where Tom's wheelchair used to scrape the wood when he misjudged the angle. Wyatt and Cole stood near the entryway, hands folded over their heavy belt buckles, silent and immobile as statues. "Have a seat," Hannah said, pointing vaguely to the beige sofa. Donovan sat. The old springs groaned in protest under his weight. His leather cut folded up around his chest, revealing the thick flannel underneath. He took his time, leaning forward, resting his massive, scarred forearms on his knees. "You sold your husband's bike for $50, Donovan said. The judgment in his voice wasn't harsh, just heavy. Factual. "I needed the money," Hannah snapped, a sudden flash of defensive anger cutting through her fear. "I needed to pay the electric bill so they wouldn't shut my heat off in November. Tom is dead. The bike was a rusting pile of trash in my garage. It was taking up space. It was—" She stopped, her throat tightening. It was a tombstone, she thought. It was the last piece of him that I couldn't fix. Donovan nodded slowly. He reached into the inner pocket of his vest and pulled out a thick, unmarked white envelope. He tossed it onto the dusty glass of the coffee table. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. "There's $2,000 in there," Donovan said. "Cash? That covers the electric bill, your groceries for the winter, and buys back the scrap metal value of what Gary thought he had." Hannah stared at the envelope. It looked radioactive. She didn't reach for it. "I don't want your money. I don't even know you. Tom wasn't part of your world. He was a sergeant in the army. He was a mechanic. He wasn't a biker." "No," Donovan agreed, leaning back slightly. The leather creaked loudly in the quiet room. He wasn't. But the man who owned that bike before him was. Hannah frowned, her brow furrowing. "Tom bought that bike off Craigslist. He brought it home in a U-Haul." "He bought it from a widow," Donovan corrected gently. "My daughter-in-law. 5 years ago." The room went completely silent. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the cheap plastic clock on the kitchen wall. Tick, tick, tick. Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Donovan, really looked at him for the first time. Beneath the hardened exterior, the gang patches, and the intimidating bulk, she saw the deep, hollowed-out exhaustion of a man who had buried his own. "That Harley," Donovan continued, his voice dropping a register, smoothing out into a quiet rumble. "It belonged to my son, Danny. He was a corporal. 2nd Battalion. He deployed with your husband. Hannah sat down hard on the edge of the mismatched armchair opposite the sofa. The upholstery was scratchy against the back of her legs. She couldn't process the words. Tom had never talked about a Danny. He barely talked about the deployment at all. The memories were locked in a vault inside his head, a vault that had fused shut the day the improvised explosive device tore through their Humvee outside of Kandahar. "Danny didn't make it back," Donovan said. He didn't look at Hannah when he said it. He looked at the gouges in the doorframe. "Your husband was driving. Danny was in the gunner's hatch. When the blast hit, Tom took the shrapnel in his spine. Danny took the shockwave. He was dead before the dust settled." Hannah closed her eyes. A sickening wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. She dug her fingernails into the palms of her hands, grounding herself in the sharp pinch of pain. Danny had just bought that bike before he deployed. Donovan continued, his gaze drifting toward the window. A 98 Softail Custom. Evo engine. It was a mess, leaked oil like a sieve. But he loved it. He told everyone in the unit that when he got back, he was going to strip it down to the bare frame. Make it loud. Make it mean. Hannah's breath hitched. Make it loud. Make it mean. They were the exact words Tom had used the day he brought the tarp-covered machine home. When the military shipped Danny's things back, the title to the bike was in his footlocker. Donovan said. My daughter-in-law couldn't stand the sight of it. She listed it for sale. I wanted to buy it, keep it in the family, but the club... We had some legal heat at the time. My assets were frozen. I couldn't scrape the cash together fast enough. Donovan finally turned his pale blue eyes back to Hannah. Tom bought it, Donovan said softly. From his hospital bed at Walter Reed. He wired her the money the week after he found out he was never going to walk again. Why? Hannah asked. The word barely escaped her lips. A single tear broke free, tracking hot and fast down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. He couldn't ride it. He knew he couldn't, because it wasn't about riding it, Hannah. Donovan said. The use of her first name felt intimate, stripping away the tough guy facade. It was about finishing the job. Tom called me from the hospital. He tracked me down through Danny's old contacts. He told me he couldn't save my boy in the dirt, but he was going to save his iron. He said he was going to build that bike with his own hands, put a sidecar on it for his chair, and ride it to Danny's grave. The internal contradiction that had been warring inside Hannah for 7 months suddenly shattered. The bitterness she had harbored toward Tom, the resentment over his depression, his silence, his refusal to let go of the rusted metal in the garage, evaporated, leaving behind a gaping, bleeding crater of guilt. He hadn't been holding on to a foolish dream. He had been carrying a ghost. He had been trying to pay a debt for a life he felt he should have saved. And she had sold it to a scrapyard scavenger for $50. She bent forward, burying her face in her hands. The smell of the industrial degreaser on her bandaged knuckles was overpowering. She let out a choked, ugly sob. It wasn't a cinematic, graceful weeping. It was a jagged, wet hacking that tore at her throat. She cried for Tom's ruined body. She cried for Danny. She cried for the sheer, cruel weight of a world that forced broken men to try and fix unfixable things. She heard the squeak of the leather sofa as Donovan stood up. A heavy, warm hand came to rest on her shoulder. The weight of it was grounding. I didn't know, Hannah gasped, her words muffled behind her hands. He never told me. He just brought it home, and then he got worse. The infections, the nerve pain, he never touched it. I thought it was a stupid, selfish toy he refused to let go of. I just wanted to be free of it. He didn't tell you because he was ashamed. Donovan said quietly, his hand remaining steady on her shaking shoulder. He promised a dead man he'd finish the job, and his body betrayed him. A man like Tom, a man who measures his worth by what he can physically endure. Failing that promise ate him alive. He didn't want you to see him fail. Hannah pulled her hands away from her face, her eyes red, her skin blotchy and wet. Gary, what did he do to it? Gary started unbolting the exhaust to sell the scrap chrome, Donovan said, a dangerous edge returning to his voice. He didn't get far. Wyatt here recognized the custom engraving on the primary cover. The club stepped in before it got chopped. So you took it, Hannah said, sniffling, wiping her nose with the back of her wrist. You got your son's bike back. No, Donovan corrected. He pulled his hand away and stepped back. We got Tom's bike back. Hannah blinked, confused. The throbbing ache in her temples flared. What do you mean? Donovan turned to Wyatt, giving a short, sharp nod. Wyatt pulled a two-way radio from his belt, keyed the mic and muttered, "Bring it up." From outside, the deep, guttural rumble of a heavy diesel engine shook the front windows. It wasn't the roar of motorcycles this time. It was the heavy, labored shifting of a large truck. I told you, Hannah, we aren't here to collect, Donovan said, his voice dropping into a solemn cadence. Tom bought that bike fair and square. He made a vow to my family. The fact that his heart gave out before he could turn a wrench doesn't void the contract. The iron belongs in your garage. No, Hannah said, standing up so fast she felt lightheaded. Panic surged back into her chest. No, you don't understand. I can't look at it. I can't have it in there. It's too heavy. I'm drowning, Donovan. I am drowning in this house. Please, just take it. Keep the envelope. Keep the bike. Just leave me alone. It's not a tombstone, Hannah, Donovan said, holding his ground. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer force of his presence pinned her in place. It's a pulse. It's a piece of history. You sold it because it felt like a rotting corpse. But you don't throw away a soldier's rifle just because he falls. You clean it. You keep it. I don't know how to clean it, Hannah shouted, the anger returning, hot and desperate. I don't know the difference between a carburetor and a spark plug. I'm a cashier at a grocery store. I can't build a motorcycle. I can't fix him. You don't have to, Donovan said. He walked past her toward the front door. He pulled it wide open. The cold air rushed back in, stinging Hannah's tear-streaked face. She walked slowly towards the door, standing beside the massive biker. A large, black flatbed tow truck was backing into her driveway, maneuvering carefully to avoid the 3 parked Harleys. Strapped securely to the bed of the truck was the rusted frame of the '98 Softail. But it looked different. It wasn't covered in a disintegrating blue tarp. The flat tires were gone, replaced by blocks of wood propping the frame up. The thick film of grey dust had been wiped away. The heavy, ugly layers of spider webs and dry rot had been stripped. It was just a skeleton of raw, dark metal, strapped tight with heavy-duty yellow ratchets. 2 more men, younger, wearing denim vests with the Prospect rocker on the bottom, jumped out of the cab of the truck. They moved quickly, unhooking the straps and preparing the hydraulic winch. Tom made a promise, Donovan said, standing on the porch, watching the men work. My club honors promises. We took it off Gary. We took it back to the clubhouse. We spent the last 3 days stripping it down to the bare bones. Hannah wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the cold, staring at the exposed metal ribs of the machine. It looked completely vulnerable. It looked like how she felt. We are going to wheel this frame back into your garage, Donovan continued, his breath pluming in the freezing air. We're going to put it right over that oil stain you tried to scrub out, and every Tuesday night, Wyatt and Cole are going to come over here with a crate of parts. Hannah looked up at him, her jaw trembling. Why? Because we are going to build it, Donovan said simply. We're going to rebuild the carb. We're going to reseat the valves. We're going to polish the rust off the chrome until you can see your reflection in it. We're going to make it loud, and we're going to make it mean. I can't pay you, Hannah whispered, her voice breaking. I can't pay for parts. You already paid, Donovan said, his eyes turning fierce. Tom paid, with his spine, his sanity, and his life. The debt is settled. Hannah watched as the winch lowered the heavy frame down the steel ramp of the flatbed. The metal groaned, but it was a different sound than when Gary had dragged it out. It didn't sound like a dead thing being hauled to a grave. It sounded like machinery. It sounded like work. The two prospects grabbed the frame and began muscling it up the driveway, heading straight for the side door of her garage. "Take the envelope on the table," Donovan said, looking down at her. "Pay your electric bill. Buy a space heater for the garage. It's going to be cold out there on Tuesday nights." "You want me out there?" Hannah asked, wiping her nose. "It's your husband's bike," Donovan said, pulling his heavy leather gloves from his back pocket and sliding them on over his thick, scarred knuckles. "You're going to hand Wyatt the wrenches. You're going to learn how to bleed a brake line. You're going to get grease under your fingernails. You're not going to hide in this house and rot alongside his memory." Hannah looked at the empty bed of the flatbed truck, then at the 3 massive Harleys parked in her driveway, and finally at the men wheeling the skeleton of Tom's broken dream back into her home. She thought about the $50 bill she had accepted from Gary. She had felt so cheap, so desperate. She thought she was cutting away the infection of grief by selling it. But grief wasn't a limb you could amputate. It was a physical law, like gravity. You couldn't sell it. You could only learn how to carry the weight. Donovan walked down the porch steps, his heavy boots crunching on the loose gravel. He swung a thick leg over his bike and turned the key. The engine didn't sputter or cough. It erupted into life, a violent, symmetrical explosion of power that vibrated the fillings in Hannah's teeth. Wyatt and Cole followed suit. The 3 men sat on their idling machines, looking at her through the haze of blue exhaust smoke. Donovan raised 2 fingers to the brim of his imaginary hat, a sign of respect. Then, he dropped the bike into gear, the transmission engaging with a heavy mechanical thunk. The 3 riders rolled out of her driveway, merging back onto the quiet suburban street, the roar of their engines echoing off the aluminum siding, drowning out the silence. Hannah stood on the porch long after they turned the corner. The smell of exhaust hung heavy in the freezing air, mixing with the scent of pine needles and impending snow. She turned and walked back inside. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel like a tomb anymore. She walked into the living room, picked up the thick white envelope off the dusty glass table, and squeezed it in her hands. It was heavy. She walked to the kitchen and looked out the side window. The garage door was open. The 2 young prospects were inside, centering the stripped metal frame perfectly over the stubborn black oil stain on the concrete floor. Hannah looked down at her hands. The skin on her knuckles was raw and bleeding from the wire brush, stinging sharply. She walked over to the sink, ran the warm water, and grabbed the dish soap. She began scrubbing the industrial chemicals off her hands, watching the pink, soapy water swirl down the drain. Tuesday was her day off. She would need to buy a space heater. And maybe some shop rags. She turned off the water, dried her hands, and took a deep breath. For the first time in 7 months, the air didn't catch in her throat. She could breathe. The ghost hadn't left. It had just brought backup. The space heater was a $30 cylindrical piece of junk from a big box store. It sat on the concrete, humming a high-pitched rattling drone, glowing with an angry orange coil that heated exactly 2 square feet of the freezing garage. Hannah stood in front of it, rubbing her arms. Her breath formed pale clouds in the damp February air. At exactly 6 p.m. the rumble started at the end of the street. It was Wyatt and Cole. They never drove their bikes in the snow, arriving instead in a battered Chevrolet van that smelled fiercely of stale corn chips and wet dog. The side door slid open with a screech of rusted bearings. Cole stepped out first, carrying a heavy cardboard box stained dark with grease. He was shorter than Donovan, but built like a cinder block, with a thick neck and a permanent scowl. He chewed wintergreen tobacco, occasionally spitting a dark stream into an empty Mountain Dew bottle. Wyatt followed. He was lean, wiry, and moved with a twitchy, restless energy. His hands were a map of scars, the cuticles permanently dyed black with years of embedded motor oil. They didn't knock. They walked right into the garage, setting the box down on the floor next to the bare frame. "Evening," Wyatt muttered, not looking at her. "Hi," Hannah said. She felt foolish in her oversized sweatpants and one of Tom's old flannel shirts. Cole nudged the box with the toe of his steel-toed boot. "Got the lower end back from the machine shop. Cases aboard. Crank is balanced. Time to get your hands dirty, widow." He didn't say it with malice, but the word widow stung, a sharp little prick of reality. They didn't give her a manual. They didn't gently explain the internal combustion engine. Wyatt handed her a spray can of brake parts cleaner and a wire toothbrush. "Scrub the threads on the motor mounts," he ordered, pointing to the bare frame. "Every single one. If there's a grain of sand in there when we torque the bolts, you'll strip the aluminum. Then you get to pay a machinist $80 an hour to fix your screw-up." Hannah took the can. The metal was freezing against her palm. She knelt beside the frame, the harsh chemical smell of the aerosol instantly burning her nostrils. She sprayed the bracket and scrubbed. The wire bristles bit into the metal, scraping away the stubborn grime. It was tedious, mind-numbing work. Her knees ached against the cold concrete. The knuckles she had scraped weeks ago throbbed under the strain. But she didn't stop. Cole and Wyatt ignored her, arguing over a set of micrometer readings on the workbench, their voices low and gravelly. An hour passed. Then 2. "Done," Hannah said, sitting back on her heels. Her lower back screamed in protest. Wyatt walked over, shining a harsh LED penlight into the threaded holes. He squinted. "Missed a spot on the rear left. Do it again." Hannah clamped her jaw shut. A spike of irritation flared in her chest. She wanted to throw the can at his head. Instead, she moved to the rear of the frame and sprayed it again. This became the rhythm of her winter. Every Tuesday, by mid-March, the skeleton had organs. They wrestled the heavy, polished aluminum engine block into the frame. It took all 3 of them. Hannah had to bear-hug the cylinders, her face pressed against the cold metal, straining until she saw black spots dancing in her vision, while Cole hammered the mounting bolts through the chassis with a rubber mallet. When the bolts finally seated, Hannah collapsed onto an overturned milk crate, gasping for air. Her forearms were covered in a smear of black grease. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a dark streak across her skin. Cole looked down at her. He spat into his plastic bottle. "You got a strong back, for a grocery clerk." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever given her. The garage stopped smelling like dry rot and mouse droppings. It smelled of heavy 20W50 oil, pungent gasket sealant, and the sharp, clean bite of Gojo pumice soap. Hannah kept a tub of the abrasive green jelly at the kitchen sink. No matter how hard she scrubbed, a faint crescent of black remained under her fingernails. The grocery store manager gave her a warning about her appearance. Hannah had looked him dead in the eye and told him to fire her if he wanted to. He walked away. She was changing. The overwhelming, crushing weight of the grief hadn't vanished, but it had calcified. It had turned into something hard, something she could grip. When she tightened a bolt on the transmission block, feeling the satisfying, solid click of the torque wrench, she felt a brief, microscopic sense of control in a world that had completely unraveled. But it wasn't all progress. On a rainy night in April, they were trying to run the main wiring harness along the backbone of the frame. The wires were stiff, color-coded, and confusing. Cole told her to feed the red wire through a tight gap behind the oil tank. Hannah pushed, but her fingers were numb from the cold. The wire slipped. She pushed harder, her hand jerking forward. The sharp, unfiled edge of the steel battery tray sliced across the meaty part of her palm. "Shit!" she hissed, yanking her hand back. Bright red blood welled up instantly, spilling over her skin and dripping onto the pristine, polished chrome of the primary cover. Cole sighed, heavy and annoyed. "Watch the chrome, damn it!" Hannah looked at her bleeding hand, then at Cole. A sudden, violent wave of exhaustion hit her. The late hours, the cold, the relentless demands of a machine she didn't even want. "I'm bleeding, Cole," she said, her voice shaking. "So bleed on the concrete." He snapped back, tossing her a dirty shop rag. "Wrap it. Keep pushing the wire." Hannah stared at the rag. It smelled like gasoline. She looked at the blood staining the chrome, exactly the way Gary's thumbprint had stained the bill of sale. "No," she said. She threw the rag on the floor. "I'm done for tonight." "We gotta finish this harness, Hannah," Wyatt said, stepping forward. "I said I'm done!" she yelled, her voice echoing sharply off the drywall. She kicked the milk crate across the room. It shattered against the wall. "I'm tired! I'm cold! And I am sick of freezing out here for a pile of metal that isn't going to bring him back!" Wyatt and Cole went dead silent. The space heater rattled loudly in the corner. Cole slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out his tin of wintergreen, and packed a pinch into his lip. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely indifferent. "It's not about bringing him back," Cole said, his voice flat. "It's about finishing the job. Go inside, widow. Bleed in the sink. We'll see you next Tuesday." Hannah turned on her heel, marched into the house, and slammed the door behind her. She stood at the kitchen sink, watching the blood wash down the drain, her chest heaving. She hated them. She hated the bike. But the next Tuesday, when the van pulled up, she was waiting in the garage. She had a bandage on her palm and a fresh can of brake cleaner in her hand. May arrived with a sudden, suffocating humidity. The snowmelt left the driveway permanently slick with mud, but inside the garage, the Harley was fully assembled. It was massive. Without the dust and the rust, its sheer size was intimidating. The frame was painted a deep, gloss black. The engine cases were raw, brushed aluminum, sitting in stark contrast to the heavy, mirroring chrome of the exhaust pipes. The fuel tank, which Donovan had brought over the week prior, was painted a flat, sinister matte black. There were no decals, no branding, just raw shape and muscle. It was a Tuesday night. Donovan had ridden over with Wyatt and Cole. The three men stood in a semicircle around the bike. Hannah stood near the workbench, wiping her greasy hands on a towel. "Fluids are in," Wyatt said, checking the dipstick on the oil tank and wiping it on his jeans. "Gas is in the tank. Battery is fully charged." Donovan nodded. He turned to Hannah. He held out a small silver key. "Your husband's bike, Hannah," Donovan said, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers. "You turn the key." Hannah stared at the small piece of metal, her stomach clenched. A cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck despite the muggy heat. This was it. This was the culmination of the frozen nights, the bleeding hands, and the yelling. If it started, the ghost was real. If it didn't, she didn't know what she would do. She walked forward. Her boots felt heavy on the concrete. She took the key from Donovan's thick fingers. She reached down, sliding the key into the ignition switch mounted on the dash console. "Turn it clockwise," Cole instructed gruffly. She turned it. The neutral indicator light on the dash blinked green. A sudden sharp click echoed from the starter relay. "Okay," Wyatt said, stepping back and crossing his arms. "Hit the starter button on the right handlebar. Hold it down until she catches." Hannah placed her hand on the thick rubber grip. She pressed her thumb against the black plastic button. Click. Whirr! Chug, chug. Silence. She let go. Hit it again, Donovan said. She pressed it. Whirr. Clunk. The starter motor strained, drawing heavy current from the battery, but the engine didn't fire. The pistons didn't move. Give it some throttle, Cole said. Twist the grip. Hannah twisted the throttle, flooding the carburetor with fuel. She hit the button again. Click. Nothing. Not even a whine, just a dead metallic click. The smell of unburnt 93-octane gasoline flooded the small garage, sharp and intoxicating. Battery is draining, Wyatt muttered. Starter is binding. Hannah took her hand off the handlebars. She backed away from the bike. The silence in the garage was deafening. It's dead, Hannah whispered. It's not dead, just a short somewhere, Cole said, reaching for his multimeter on the bench. No, Hannah said, her voice rising in pitch. The calcified shell around her grief cracked, splitting wide open. It's dead, just like him. Hannah, calm down, Donovan said softly, taking a step toward her. Don't tell me to calm down, she shrieked, backing away until her shoulders hit the wall. Her chest heaved. The tears she hadn't shed in months rushed out, hot and blinding. We spent months on this. I bled for this. He died for this stupid, useless piece of junk. He gave up on his physical therapy because he knew he couldn't build it. He just quit. He quit on me. She grabbed a heavy steel crescent wrench from the workbench and hurled it at the bike. It bounced off the heavy rubber of the rear tire and clattered uselessly onto the concrete floor. He left me, she sobbed, sliding down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest. He left me in this house with his medical bills and this anchor, and it doesn't even work. Cole and Wyatt stood completely still, staring at the floor. They didn't know how to handle a weeping woman. Donovan didn't flinch. He walked over to where Hannah sat on the floor. He didn't try to hug her. He didn't offer a tissue. He crouched down, his heavy leather cut creaking, until he was eye level with her. He didn't quit, Hannah, Donovan said, his voice a low, steady rumble. His heart stopped. That's a mechanical failure, not a moral one. Hannah shook her head, burying her face in her knees. It's broken. We can't fix it. Look at me, Donovan commanded. Hannah slowly raised her head. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. Donovan pointed to the ignition coil bolted to the frame. You see that ground wire? The black one bolted to the chassis? Hannah sniffled, looking at the thick wire. Yes, metal needs to touch metal for the electricity to flow. Donovan explained, his tone even, like a teacher explaining a math problem. We painted this frame. The paint is thick. It looks good, but it's an insulator. The electricity from the battery is hitting a wall of paint. It can't complete the circuit. It's got nowhere to go. He stood up, grabbed a flathead screwdriver from the bench, and walked over to the bike. He unbolted the ground wire. With the sharp edge of the screwdriver, he viciously scraped away the fresh black paint right down to the bare, shiny steel underneath. He bolted the wire back down tight against the raw metal. You're mad at Tom because he couldn't finish the circuit, Donovan said, tossing the screwdriver onto the bench. But you're the ground wire now, Hannah. You're the connection. He looked at her, pointing a thick finger at the seat. Get up. Hannah wiped her eyes with her dirty hands. She used the wall to push herself to her feet. She walked slowly back to the bike. Turn the key, Donovan said. She turned it. The green light flickered on. Hit it. Hannah pressed the button. The starter motor didn't whine. It engaged with a violent metallic clack. The engine turned over once, twice. Then an explosion. The garage shook. A concussive shockwave of sound blasted from the dual exhaust pipes. It wasn't a hum. It was a rhythmic, deafening, physical force. "Potato, potato, potato!" The sound hit Hannah in the chest, vibrating her ribs, rattling the tools on the workbench. A thick puff of blue smoke shot out of the tailpipes, filling the air with the stinging scent of burnt oil and rich fuel. The engine settled into a heavy, thumping idle. It sounded like a massive, mechanical heartbeat. Loud, mean. Hannah stood frozen, her hand still hovering near the throttle. The noise was overwhelming, drowning out every thought in her head. She looked at Wyatt. He was grinning, a rare, genuine smile that showed a chipped tooth. Cole was nodding slowly, spitting into his bottle. Donovan stepped up behind her. He didn't yell over the noise. He just placed his heavy, warm hand on her shoulder and squeezed. Hannah stared at the shaking metal beast. The tears started again, but they weren't hot and angry. They were a release. The tomb was finally open. The ghost was out. The first Saturday in June was brilliant and sharp. The sky was an aggressive, cloudless blue. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of cut grass and warm asphalt. Hannah stood in her driveway. She was wearing her old denim jacket, thick jeans, and a pair of sturdy boots. Her hair was tied back tight. The Harley sat idling in the driveway. In the sunlight, the gloss-black paint looked like wet glass. The chrome was blinding, but it was what was attached to the right side of the bike that made the neighbors peek through their blinds. It was a sidecar. It wasn't a pristine, color-matched piece of luxury. It was an old, heavy Ural sidecar body that Cole had sourced from a scrapyard in Pennsylvania. They had welded a custom tubular frame to mount it to the Softail. It was painted the same flat matte black as the fuel tank. Inside, the seat was wrapped in thick, weather-beaten brown leather. Donovan stood next to the bike, adjusting the chin strap on a heavy, scuffed black helmet. He wore his full Hell's Angels colors, the death head patch stark against the bright morning sun. "Ready?" he asked, his voice barely carrying over the heavy idle of the Evo engine. Hannah swallowed hard. Her stomach was doing flips. She hadn't ridden in a car without a seatbelt in a decade, let alone an open-air metal tub bolted to a vibrating bomb. She nodded. She walked over to the sidecar and stepped in. It was deeper than she expected. She sank into the brown leather. It smelled like old dust and saddle soap. She reached into her jacket pocket and felt the stiff, folded paper inside. Donovan handed her a helmet. It was slightly too big, the foam lining pressing awkwardly against her cheeks. She strapped it down. Donovan swung his massive leg over the saddle. The bike groaned slightly under his weight. He pulled the clutch lever in, stomped on the shifter with his left boot, and the transmission engaged with a heavy clunk. "Hold on," he said, turning his head slightly. He rolled the throttle back. The acceleration was terrifying and instantaneous. Hannah was shoved deep into the leather seat. The wind hit her face like a physical wall. The noise of the engine, no longer confined to the garage, roared out across the suburban street, bouncing off the trees and parked cars. They hit the main road, and Donovan opened it up. Hannah squeezed her eyes shut for the first mile. The vibration traveled from the floorboards of the sidecar straight up her spine. Every bump in the asphalt jarred her teeth. She felt exposed, vulnerable, entirely at the mercy of the machine and the man piloting it. But as they cleared the town limits and hit the two-lane state highway that wound out toward the county lines, she slowly opened her eyes. The world was moving in a blur of green and gray. The wind whipped her jacket, tearing the air from her lungs. The smell of pine needles, wet earth, and hot engine oil mixed into a sensory overload. She looked over at Donovan. He sat perfectly upright, his hands loose on the handlebars, completely relaxed as he navigated the heavy, awkward rig through the sweeping curves. Hannah realized she was gripping the metal edge of the sidecar so hard her knuckles ached. She forced herself to loosen her fingers. She took a deep breath of the rushing air. It felt like flying. It felt violent, chaotic, and entirely alive. 20 minutes later, Donovan slowed down, downshifting with a series of loud, popping exhaust backfires. They turned through a pair of heavy wrought-iron gates. Oakwood Cemetery was vast and rolling, the green hills dotted with rows of white and grey granite. Donovan navigated the narrow, paved paths slowly, the engine grumbling a low, respectful idle. He pulled over near the far east corner, beneath the sprawling branches of a massive, ancient oak tree. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was shocking. It left a ringing in Hannah's ears. The only sound was the ticking of the hot exhaust pipes cooling in the breeze and the distant chirping of a cardinal. Hannah unbuckled her helmet and pulled it off. Her hands were shaking, a mixture of adrenaline and cold. She climbed out of the sidecar, her legs feeling like jelly as her boots hit the grass. Donovan secured his helmet to the handlebars. He walked past her, his heavy boots silent on the manicured lawn. Hannah followed. They stopped in front of two headstones, sitting side by side in a small shaded plot. The first stone was older, the edges slightly weathered. Corporal Daniel Donovan, 1989 to 2012, beloved son, brave soldier. The second stone was newer, the granite still sharp and unblemished. Sergeant Thomas Miller, 1985 to 2023, devoted husband until we meet again. Hannah stood at the foot of Tom's grave. The grass hadn't fully grown back over the disturbed earth yet. She looked at the carved letters of his name. For 7 months she had looked at this stone and felt nothing but a crushing, suffocating anger. Anger at the war, anger at his broken body, anger at him for leaving her alone with a rusty pile of metal. She didn't feel angry anymore. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the folded piece of paper. It was the $50 bill she had taken from Gary. She had flattened it out, but the faint, brownish-red stain of the bloody thumbprint was still visible in the corner. She knelt down. The damp earth soaked through the knees of her jeans. She placed the bill on the top of Tom's headstone. She reached over, picked up a small, smooth grey stone from the edge of the marker, and set it on top of the money so the wind wouldn't take it. "Debt's paid, Tommy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The iron is clean." She stood up. Donovan was standing in front of Danny's grave. He hadn't brought flowers. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavily worn spark plug, and set it against the base of the granite. He rested his hand on top of the headstone for a long moment, bowing his head. He stepped back and turned to Hannah. The deep lines in his face seemed slightly less harsh in the dappled sunlight beneath the oak tree. "We ride back on Tuesday," Donovan said quietly. "We're going to tear the carburetor down again. It's running too rich. Cole doesn't like the idle." Hannah looked back at the massive black motorcycle parked on the path, the sidecar waiting. It was loud. It was mean. It was a terrifying, beautiful monster that required constant care, dirty hands, and busted knuckles. Just like memory. Just like love. "All right," Hannah said, zipping her jacket against the wind, "but I'm holding the wrench this time." Donovan smiled, a small, barely perceptible upward curve of his mouth beneath the grey beard. "You always were, Hannah. Let's go home. If this story of grit, grease, and finding healing in the hardest places hit home for you, don't scroll past. Hit that like button to honor the promises we keep to the ones we've lost. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that even the most rusted, broken pieces of our lives can be rebuilt if we're willing to get our hands dirty. And make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another raw, real story that cuts straight to the bone. Drop a comment below. What's the hardest thing you've had to rebuild?